the Climate Center. We're happy to have you all here today joining us for our Climate Friday virtual town hall. Today's topic is climate justice, the California reality and what you can do. I want to thank our staff, Janina Turner and Stacy Meinzen, for all your help in making this work today. For those of you who are new to the Climate Center, we are a climate and energy policy nonprofit with a mission of speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions starting in California. Next slide, please. So Stacy, if you can move it to the next slide, that would be great. Thanks. So our special guests today are Katie Valenzuela from the California Environmental Justice Alliance and Destiny Rodriguez, Community Relations Manager of the Climate Center. And we'll come back to this slide a little bit later so you can have a minute to read their bios. But we're very excited to have both of you with us, Destiny and Katie. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. The Climate Center's mission is speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions. We're best known for our key role in the phenomenal expansion of community choice energy, or CCAs. The CCAs have gone from just 5 or 6 years ago to 21 today that now serve over 11 million Californians with 88% clean energy. A fantastic example of speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions. Next slide. We're now working to scale up those efforts, building on the many partnerships we have, including with many of you who are attending today, as we face a climate crisis that is worse than anticipated, accelerating, and threatening all life. In fact, 9 of 15 global tipping points have already been activated. You all probably know that in the last few weeks, there was record-breaking heat north of the Arctic Circle in Siberia. Now there are huge wildfires. Fortunately, we still have time to prevent an inhospitable to life hothouse climate if we act soon. As the United Nations scientists conservatively recommended almost 2 years ago, we have to cut emissions globally in half and start initial drawdown from the atmosphere by 2030 to prevent even more catastrophic impacts. What does that mean for us in California? That means that we have to be at the forefront of climate action as we have been in the past because we influence so many others. We have to accelerate our climate action timelines. And in that light, we have launched a bold and urgently needed collaborative campaign called Climate Safe California. Our goal is to double current state targets by 2030 based on the science and the physics of what's actually happening with climate change globally. Specifically, by 2022, we want to double existing policy timelines to achieve 80% below 1990 greenhouse gas levels and begin the process of drawdown of emissions from the atmosphere that we already dumped there to get to net negative emissions and keep growing that. Next slide. Part of our strong commitment is to ensure that there's a just transition for workers and that all policies we implement through Climate Safe California engage workers in creating the jobs for the building, construction, and other trades so that together we can solve the climate crisis. Next slide. And the other key principle for us in all the policies that we're working on are to close the climate gap. And that's a lot of what we'll hear today from our guest speakers, that we want to ensure that lower income communities are no longer disproportionately harmed by fossil fuel development, production, and use. And we want to prioritize these communities in these climate safe policies because we know that climate justice is in fact racial justice. We must ensure that everyone is able to participate in the clean energy economy. Next slide. We need widespread support to make this happen. A simple step you can take today, if you haven't already, is to endorse our campaign as an individual or as an organization or business. Even in these early stages, we already have over 330 initial endorsements. So I challenge you today, right now, to generate at least 10 new endorsements during our webinar, and I'll report at the end how many we've gotten. The link to endorse is in our chat, but you can also go to climatesafeca.org. I see there's an E missing on that slide, climatesafeca.org, or the climatecenter.org/endorsement. And we'd love for you to join our action email list with weekly news updates and actions you can take to make a difference. Next slide. I'd also like to invite you to our August 5th online Community Energy Resilience Policy Summit with some fantastic speakers from the Energy Commission, the Public Utility Commission, and Mayor of Oxnard. It's going to be a fantastic presentation. The bottom line is that our state clean energy programs and policies have not sufficiently prioritized lower income communities. As we are proposing with new state efforts focused on clean energy resilience, we need to avoid continuing to make the same mistake. This policy summit will highlight the latest legislative and regulatory developments related to transitioning to a new California energy infrastructure that is clean, affordable, resilient, equitable, and safe. And you can sign up for this at resiliencesummit.net. Next slide, please. This is our vision for the future, but I want to remember and have us all take a moment to think about the recent deaths of Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others at the hands of police. These acts are intolerable, and they put issues of systemic racism front and center for us all. Many communities of color are at the front line of toxic and polluting fossil fuel infrastructure, with freeways, refineries, and oil rigs dangerously close to homes, schools, and hospitals. These communities suffer much lower life expectancy and higher rates of asthma, cancer, and other diseases than white people and those in wealthier neighborhoods. And these same communities of color are being hit much harder by the pandemics of COVID-19 and climate. We know that there cannot be climate justice without racial justice, and we stand in solidarity with communities of color and commit to greater efforts at dismantling systemic racism throughout our society, and especially in our climate and clean energy world. Next slide, please. We are really honored to have Katie Valenzuela, Policy and Political Director at the California Environmental Justice Alliance, and Destiny Rodriguez, Community Relations Manager at the Climate Center, for an interactive conversation today with you about how climate justice is racial justice and is essential to achieving the goals of climate safe California. Our special guest will present on the health, economic, and other consequences of our fossil fuel economy on lower income communities and people of color, current legislative efforts, including AB 345, and all the efforts to reduce the disproportionate impacts on these frontline communities and what actions we can take to secure an equitable, healthy, and vibrant future. We have a great program today. Welcome, everyone, and I'll hand it off to Destiny. Welcome, Destiny, and thank you. And if everybody can put their slides on speaker view, that would be great. Thank you. Take it away, Destiny. You just have to, yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Ellie. Hi, everybody. My name is Destiny Rodriguez. I live and work in the Central Valley. It is a place that I call my home. However, in the Central Valley, my home has several problems, both due to climate change and industry, and I'm going to talk to you today about what those challenges are. So many of you may already be aware, and if you're not, the Valley suffers from extreme hazardous air quality on a frequent basis. This is just a picture of what a hazy, bad air day looks like in the Central Valley. It's very common, unfortunately. Because we live in a basin, our geography tends to be like a bowl, and unfortunately pollutants are trapped in our region, and because of inversion layers, a lot of that pollution gets impacted and pushed down. So it's on a level where people are breathing it every single day. And unfortunately, we do have a lot of industry, several diesel trucks coming through every hour, every few hours, and all of this is contributing to our bad air quality. And by the way, all these pictures are pictures from the Central Valley. So I just wanted to be cognizant of that. We do have a lot of emissions from vehicles. Unfortunately, because of climate change, we have drier conditions, and this has caused more frequency of wildfires. This is just an example of a wildfire in Yosemite. And as you can see, this was the actual fire, but the smoke from the fire goes directly into the Central Valley, where unfortunately we have to breathe all of that particulate. We are an ag-rich area, but because we are ag-rich, we do have a lot of pesticide use. And we do need better regulations for pesticide use, especially when we have buffer zones near schools and near neighborhoods. We need to widen those buffer zones because they're very close. This is an example of some pesticides being sprayed. And actually, I unfortunately, once when I was driving, I think it was on the 41 going towards South Valley, it was early in the morning, and I actually was sprayed by an airplane, a crop duster that just came over, and luckily I had my windows up. But these things, again, are very, very common here. People live with this every day. In the wintertime, we have chimney smoke. A lot of people like to burn recreationally for fun and don't really think about the impacts that that already has on our current problems. We have a lot of ag wood burning. This is just an example of some ag wood burning. This happened in Merced, and as you can see, there are piles and piles and piles of wood being burned, and it's just only contributing and exacerbating our current problems. So with all of these environmental challenges, we have so many impacts to health locally. And it's a travesty, seriously, because our emergency rooms will be filled with undocumented, low income, and people that have no insurance because their children are suffering from asthma or some other respiratory condition. And the emergency room is their primary care. And with all of this, we also have PM 2.5, which is particulate matter 2.5. That's the metric measurement of it. And what that does is it's a result of a complex chemical reaction of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. And these are emitted from industries and vehicles. They only contribute to the problem. We have days where our air quality is so bad that we can't allow children to go outside to play, because if they were to breathe the air, even if they didn't have asthma, they would essentially sunburn their lungs. That's how bad our air quality is in the Central Valley. That is something that we live with day to day. And I can tell you right now, with climate change and the frequency of wildfires, there are currently 6 fires right now outside the Central Valley. I can tell you, in the morning, I can smell the smoke. And in the evening, I can smell the smoke from those fires that are miles and miles away. We are impacted here. Because of COVID, many residents in the Central Valley have been severely economically impacted, not just health-wise. I can tell you with Fresno County, our stats are about 9,000 cases of COVID, and it's growing every day. We have 91 deaths so far in Fresno County, and of these cases, 55% of them are Latino, 55%. Unemployment rates have gone up as well. I can tell you more than 142,000 workers across Fresno, Kings, Merced, Madera, and Tulare counties were out of work in May. The unemployment rate in May was 15.7%, and coronavirus has only driven a higher unemployment rate in Fresno County. We were already considered a low-income area. COVID has only exacerbated this economic problem. The pandemic has disproportionately affected our most vulnerable communities of color, our low-income communities, and our undocumented populations. Many people in these communities have a lack of critical information of how to protect themselves, how to protect their families. from COVID. Immigrant farm workers are among California's most marginalized populations, and they are on the front lines of this epidemic, making sure that we all have food on the table, putting themselves at risk. However, because of the lack of communication from our county electeds, we are seeing an increase in these unincorporated areas, which are primarily Latino populations. And with the unemployment rate going up, many are unable to pay rent. Evictions are still happening in this region. And the reality is families cannot stretch their dollars under these conditions. They were already struggling before. It's just gotten worse for most people. So on May 31st, the Black Lives Matter movement hit Fresno. We had a huge George Floyd protest of a crowd of over 3,000 protesters, one of the largest nonviolent protests in the state. We had no police violence, and this was amazing because everyone came together for racial justice. And some of the demands that the movement created from this was that elected officials must inform communities on the process for deciding what the budget is and create more transparency, more community and public involvement in these decisions, to mandate nonviolent training for police officers, and to establish a more diverse police force, and a very unique demand, which is creating stricter regulations for industrial plants, that they should not be allowed to expose the Black community to their toxins. Now, if you're not from the Central Valley or from West Fresno, you might be wondering, why would somebody ask, for a stricter regulation on industrial plants and that they should not be allowed to expose to the Black community? The reason is the EPA says that West Fresno, people that live in West Fresno, have higher health risks than anyone in California, higher than any part of Los Angeles or Oakland. And this is a picture, a screenshot of CalEnviroscreen, which also shows air pollution exposure. As you can see, the Central Valley is a hotbed for pollution. And this picture right here, I don't know if you can see it very well, but this little red area right here, that's Fresno. That's Fresno right there. The life expectancy in West Fresno is actually less than 20 years lower than Northeast Fresno, according to a study in 2012. The study was conducted by the Central Valley Health Policy Institute at Fresno State. West Fresno is at the top of the list for CalEnviroscreen, along with several other valley zip codes not very far behind. The problem is real and we need solutions now. Now, South Valley. In South Valley in Kern County, fracking is a method of oil and gas extraction that allows a company to retrieve more of the resource. This is known as a very detrimental environmental impact for people in Kern County. I can tell you Kern County produces 75% of California's petroleum, 50% of natural gas. And as far as oil production, Kern is second to Texas. And this picture that I'm showing you is a Chevron fracking field. This is our reality. Fracking is also a threat to groundwater contamination because it uses carcinogenic chemicals in the mixture, and those chemicals go into the groundwater. And if there is a neighborhood or a community nearby, that goes directly into their water that they use for drinking, for bathing, for washing, and they are exposed to that. I'm sorry, I get a little emotional because it really is a terrible thing to see. This is why we need to act now to protect these communities and our valley. So one of the things that I'm working on in the Central Valley is community choice energy. A large focus is getting community choice energy up and running and getting it established here in the Central Valley. Because really what it does is it focuses on renewable energy, which will help us to transition away from fossil fuels and focus on just using clean renewable energy, which is what we all should be doing. It's not a solution to every problem, but it is a vehicle that can drive us to be more self-sufficient and less reliant on our fossil fuel industries. Some of the benefits include local control, having a choice of who your energy provider is, transparency, public process, revenues that are reinvested locally and can be used to create community-tailored programs to fit community needs, and it generates green jobs. If you are interested in learning more about community choice energy, I encourage you to please contact me, and I am happy to have a one-on-one conversation with you. The COVID pandemic is a reminder of what happens when we ignore when we ignore science. We need to accelerate existing state policies now. There are people suffering right now as I'm speaking. There are people in the emergency room with their children. There are people suffering from COVID. There are people suffering from homelessness, from evictions. And our climate is also suffering as well. Our goal is to reach a net negative emissions by 2030 in California. And I encourage you all to help us reach our goals. And I believe we're going to put the link in the chat. And honestly, this takes 2 minutes, maybe less than 2 minutes, to make a lasting impact for our home state. We have much, much work to do. And if you would like to support our work at the Climate Center, if you would like to support my work with Community Choice Energy, and you are in a position to donate, I encourage you to do so, because we need support so we can continue our efforts in working towards a better tomorrow. We all must act now to protect our most vulnerable communities of color. Toxic infrastructures are only increasing the dangers of climate change. Climate change is a racial justice issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Destiny. Excellent. Really appreciate your passion and expertise and knowledge that you shared with us today. Really powerful. Thank you so much. Next, I'm really pleased to introduce Katie Valenzuela of the California Environmental Justice Alliance. Katie, please take it away. And actually, I'm sorry, before you start, I apologize. Just want to encourage people to put any questions you have for Destiny or Katie into the chat, and we have staff collecting those, and we will get into those in another few minutes. So thank you all. Go ahead, Katie, please.
Of course, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about climate justice and my work for CEJA. A little bit about me. I was born and raised in Oildale, Kern County, which is right in the middle of some of those oil fields that Destiny just showed you. I've been in Sacramento since 2009. I was actually just elected to the Sacramento City Council here, so I'll start doing some split role work between CEJA and that. And collectively, I have over 2 decades of organizing and advocacy experience. And no, I'm not that old. I actually started when I was 13. I was that kid who was in the emergency departments and the urgent cares in Kern County. And my parents were very active in organizing around that. And I was raised to do this work. So thank you again for having me. So California Environmental Justice Alliance, or CEJA as we call it, is a statewide alliance of grassroots organizing groups. We're working together across these jurisdictions to make important policy change at the state level to address environmental injustice. And before I get into the rest of my presentation, I just want to caveat that I'm going to talk a lot about BIPOC communities, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So I didn't want you to hear me say that and say, what is she talking about? It's BIPOC is a new acronym to try to be more inclusive about our communities and who we're talking about. So before I get too deep into the work, I want to give you a sneak peek into a bill that we've been working on with our members, AB 345. This bill is sponsored by Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, who's a core member of CEJA, as well as Vision, a statewide alliance of frontline communities directly impacted by oil, and is based on decades and years of work that these communities have been doing to try to advocate for themselves and improve public health for them and their children, and really shows the power not just of grassroots communities working together across jurisdictions, but also when statewide allies unite together to lift up those voices in policy. The fact that we are where we are is really a result of that foundational model, and is what climate justice looks like in action, is lifting up those voices of folks who are directly impacted by the issue. So that bill is currently in the Senate. We are working with the Climate Center and a whole range of groups to try to get it across the finish line. And believe it or not, we're in 2020 and we're still talking about whether we should put oil extraction next to homes and schools, which is a little mind-boggling when you put that in context of our quote-unquote leadership on climate issues. So to scale back out a little bit to what we're talking about when we talk about environmental justice, and to revisit the map that Destiny just showed you, this work is both about process, how communities are engaged, and it is very much about racial justice. Across the states, communities with high pollution burdens and poor health outcomes are BIPOC communities, and this has roots in really racialized land use policy. And like to ground us in these really uncomfortable photos that illustrate the process that we use to relocate and segregate BIPOC communities from white communities. These meant that folks didn't have access to positive attributes, to good air quality, to good parks, and were often located in parts of the state that had negative attributes. We were located near industrial sources, far away from clean air, clean water, and many other amenities. And while these policies have long been legally prohibited, when you look at maps of segregation and redlining, you will still see that BIPOC communities are largely still living in the communities that were built for us and are suffering the poor health outcomes as a result of that. So in recognition of that issue, AB 32, which many of you know is California's landmark climate law, was really intentional about trying to address this historic inequity. It didn't just create an environmental justice advisory committee, it really required important process points and called out not only that communities shouldn't be further harmed by our climate policy, but that they should benefit from climate policy. And to illustrate this, I did a quick excerpt of this bill. And if you haven't read AB 32, I strongly encourage you to. It was a really comprehensive vision of what it would look like to unite our housing needs and our transportation systems with new investment and new economic shifts that were not dependent on fossil fuels, so that we could really achieve our climate targets in a way that also addressed historic inequity and helped BIPOC communities benefit. However, despite this very beautiful long bill, it really the only enforceable provision is a GHG target, which is how many of you know AB 32, which was the 2030 or the 2020 target. And that has been really problematic for how we've implemented climate policy in California. First, what we did when we implemented AB 32 is we set a statewide target, which meant that while we met the 2020 number in law, that doesn't mean that every sector in California saw reductions. In fact, Most of the reductions that have let us meet our 2020 target early came from renewable energy investments and the progress we've made in decarbonizing the energy sector and the recession, honestly. And so that's something that I think is best illustrated by the transportation dip we saw start in 2008 that has now picked back up again and is continuing to pick up, as many of you may know. When we dive specifically into what industry trends are, and this chart's a little out of date, but it still tells the same story that we see today, is that the top 3 sectors where we're seeing the highest levels of pollution are largely due to the extraction, production, and use of fossil fuels in California. And we have failed to make any meaningful progress on that entire sector of emissions in our state. However, when we updated our scoping plan in 2018, we didn't propose anything new. We largely leaned on the policies that we had created when we first started implementation of AB 32, despite evidence that they weren't necessarily working and that they wouldn't necessarily produce the amount of reductions that we need to reach the 2030 target or to go beyond that target, as the Climate Center has talked about in their campaign. So much so that the chair of the Air Resources Board at the meeting where that plan was endorsed actually said from the dais that we know this isn't enough and that we need to start figuring out what additional progress is going to look like to meet the 2030 target and achieve the promise of climate policy in California. However, rather than jump into this work with both foot and tackle the root cause of what we're seeing and persisting in California in terms of direct sources of emissions, what we're seeing is that researchers and advocates are turning to geoengineering and other mechanisms to try to reduce carbon from the atmosphere to try to prevent climate change, which fails to address the underlying and really problematic practices that are contributing to the continued emissions and poor health outcomes in our communities. And I'm sure I know what some of you are thinking, why can't we do both? Why can't we do both these artificial carbon practices and do direct emissions reductions measures? And I will simply say that both is not what's being put on the table in California. Overwhelmingly, what we are hearing as advocates at the Capitol is that we've done as much as we can, and now we need to lean on these alternative strategies to try to get to the 2030 target and beyond, which fails to recognize the fact that there's still been no meaningful impact on direct emissions reductions in our communities. And the worry is that the deployment of these technologies will further delay that conversation and further mean that we fail to reduce the pollution and public health burdens on BIPOC communities and still make progress on our carbon targets and call that a win, which in our mind is not a win. I want to do a quick caveat too, because we talk a lot about carbon and co-pollutants, and the co-pollutants are the things that really impact public health directly, while carbon is more the mechanism of which climate change is happening, which impacts public health also, but less directly. And I just need to say that, I mean, these sources of pollution, where carbon comes from, other things come from as well. It's not an isolated practice. And this is why direct emissions reductions is such a focus for our work, because we know that reducing things at the source will not only reduce carbon, it will also reduce the harmful co-pollutants and toxic pollutants that come from those activities. So that by doing that, we get to both. And especially given the sense of urgency and the lack of resources we have in this space, especially in this time of crisis, we think it is even more important for us to start focusing our investments on these direct emissions reductions measures that will do all of the above and not just part of the challenge. So what does the path forward look like for the work in California? It's very simply, as I've put, to prioritize direct emissions reductions. This is something that we think will really force the hard questions in California about how we're going to move goods, how we're going to continue to produce what we need while addressing the systemic issues and pollution burdens that those historic practices have created for our communities. And so for us, this means when we look at AB 345, like, yes, we want to start taking measures to protect communities from oil extraction, but we also need to talk about setting a target for ending fossil fuel production, extraction, and use in California, which has been an elusive target at the Capitol and something that we really appreciate folks' allyship on. Related to that, as Ellie mentioned in the introduction, is this just transition and just recovery. We need to think about what this means for oil field workers who are overwhelmingly also residents of environmental justice communities and suffering from those health burdens as well. And how do we create a pathway for employment in Kern County, in LA County, and parts of the state beyond, so that folks have access to good jobs without having to pay the cost of the public health impact that the fossil fuel and other industries bring. And finally, and I think most importantly and foundational to the environmental justice and climate justice movement, is to let communities lead. I put photos up here of some recent examples of times when a small group of residents have been able to stop bills, have been able to start public health rulemakings at CalGEM, all because we were able to bring decision makers directly to those community voices and let them speak for themselves. The power is uncalculable. It's just amazing what I've been able to see communities accomplish. And a lot of my work I see, and a lot of our work needs to be, how do we facilitate more of that voice and decision making? Because not only are they the folks who are most directly impacted by these challenges, but their voice has just amazing power to influence decision makers and really bring about the change that we need to see to achieve these goals. So I will end there and leave space for questions. These are our websites. I encourage you to check us out. We have a C3 and a C4. We do political work as well. And I encourage you to please consider a donation to our work. We share all of that revenue with our members and support the member work. This is the last time we were able to gather in person. I often put this photo in my presentations as a nostalgic point to remember what folks look like all together. But it's amazing work, and we're happy to answer your questions and continue the discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie. Excellent presentation. We're really grateful for your leadership. Excellent. So let's start. I have some questions here. And again, I want to invite all of our participants to put questions in the chat and we will capture them. So first question for Katie. Can the clean energy industry harness enough political power to help bring about the phase out of fossil fuels? And what kinds of programs can pull lower income communities into clean energy jobs?
Absolutely. I think a lot of our members are very focused on clean energy and work with local CCAs and other initiatives to try to achieve that end. I think the trick is really making sure that it's a regional approach, that it's not, wind energy that's being built, 100 miles away, but that we're working on building more projects here, because that's where you'll see the jobs benefits and really start to build that economic drive that will help not only provide a good, meaningful path for workers that are impacted by fossil fuel decline, which has been happening long before climate policy happened in California, but could also help us help communities reimagine what a more robust economic framework would look like. One of my favorite examples is that when LA Metro transitioned to zero emission buses and made that commitment, they didn't just buy buses from anywhere, they bought buses from a company producing in Lancaster because they knew that would create a really great jobs benefit that would help their local communities. So that's my slightly long answer to that question.
No, not too long. That was great. Thank you. Destiny, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Not at this time, actually.
Okay, no pressure. I just wanted to be sure. If I call on one of you and the other wants to say something, just jump in, okay? A question for you, Destiny. How do we get community choice energy options in Lodi, Stockton, and Fresno areas?
That's a great question. We're actually working towards getting community choice energy established in Stockton. I can confidently tell you that a request for proposal has already been issued out, and actually Stockton's in the process of deciding which consultant company to go with to do a technical study for the city of Stockton, which will put hard facts and numbers of what revenues will look like for the area. As far as Lodi and the other cities that were mentioned, we really need to engage the county to get full buy-in so that the other surrounding cities will also have the opportunity to get the benefits of community choice energy. But until we can actually engage those counties or possibly connect the cities to each other, those conversations I don't believe have started, but I'm happy to get them started. And if people are willing and wanting to see that in the area, please again reach out to me.
Thank you, Destiny. Okay, another question here. What would it take, Katie, to change the policy of 40% carve-outs for disadvantaged communities to 5% carve-outs for privileged communities?
Is that a serious question?
Well,
I will just say, and you're hitting though on a point that has come up quite a bit in our work, and something that I want to address, because a lot of folks were frustrated with the Cal Virus Green Map when it was created, because it was used to direct investments. And folks often said, you know, what about like other communities? Other communities have needs, they have public health challenges. And to put it quite bluntly, you know, this is climate money. This is money from polluters. This money deserves to go back to the communities that are most impacted by pollution, and those are BIPOC communities overwhelmingly across the state. That yes, there are other challenges in the state that definitely deserve and need attention, but that is not what the climate money is for. So that is my brief answer to that.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. Okay, what can we do as far as access to clean transportation policy to address climate and equity issues during COVID? Katie, want to go first on that? Or?
This is where our state policy really falls short. We are very siloed at the state level, and it's seen in just the way we break out policy committees, where we break out state agencies. We've created these really separate entities to attack a challenge, when really the outcome of that work is felt all together. Like, we're very intersectional people. You don't just care about where your food comes from and how your kids get to school. You know, you also care about what home you live in, the air quality, the tree canopy. It all intersects on people. So people-centered policymaking is really what environmental justice is based on. So it's not just at the state level, it's also at the local level. There's so much at the local level we need to be doing to promote affordable housing near jobs, to promote better transit and transportation options that don't rely on fossil fuel modes. And there's a lot that local jurisdictions can be doing to address those challenges. COVID really just shined a bright spotlight on inequities and issues that were always there. Really, I hope that what COVID does is push local governments to be a lot more ambitious in their planning, to be a lot more inclusive in their planning, so we can be thinking about job opportunities and housing opportunities and transportation opportunities in a way that means everybody has good jobs, everybody has savings, everybody has healthcare, so that it's no longer, when crises like this occur in the past, it doesn't have such a disproportionate impact on our BIPOC communities.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. From San Diego, the San Diego Energy District seeks to know if anyone in California has experience with virtual power plants in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Do either of you have knowledge about that?
That's a new one to me.
I've heard of it, but I'm not an expert on that. So.
Okay, great. So Lane, who asked that question, will try to find out some other answers for you and let you know. What success to both of you have you had in reaching out to and involving workers and unions?
I can start with that one. So I am currently in communications with some of the local labor unions and hopeful that they will be encouraged to support community choice energy. Just started those conversations, and at this point in time, the labor unions, I've been told, need to do a little more research, and then they will talk to me. But if you are part of a labor union or you work with one and you're on this event right now, please reach out and let them know that this is something that you would like to see in your community, because that will definitely encourage the conversation to move towards CCA.
Yeah, and at the state level, we have been, this is a constant quest to work more with labor on specific issues like zero emission transit and, clean transportation options. It's a lot easier, I think, when you get into the more nebulous and even specific fossil fuel policy, it becomes very difficult. And labor and statewide groups like SEIU have a whole environmental justice platform, which has been really exciting. And we've been working with them a lot on legislation like AB 345 and other groups like the building trades are less open to this because their job is to protect their workers, and justifiably so. They don't see a path forward for workers yet in their regions that would ensure jobs are protected and that those folks still have employment. So we are still working on that. It's not a fault of the climate policy. Someone who grew up in Oildale, there have been layoffs in the oil field since before I can remember paying attention to that stuff when I was a young child. So it's something that's relatively inevitable, we think, and so we really are looking for those solutions and opportunities as we keep moving forward in the work.
Thank you. And I would like to mention, as a fantastic example, is the decommissioning of the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant near San Luis Obispo, working with the local community, all different parts of the community, including labor, and coming up with a plan for how to phase it out. I think there's a really great blueprint for all of us to use in other parts of the state, such as in Fresno and Kern County. And we ought to be figuring out how to, and we at the Climate Center are starting to work on that as well. Just how can we work with the unions to come up with a solution, engage them in the problem solving so that we can all see a positive future for ourselves. Thank you. Okay, another question here. How are CEJA and the Climate Center involved in current discussions to redo cap and trade and offsets?
Yes, thank you, Kathy, for asking that question. We've been really heavily involved in the debates and fight against cap and trade since it was created. The system of being able to purchase additional credits for pollution and to trade credits across entities has really facilitated continued emissions and sometimes growth of emissions in environmental justice communities. I will hint also at an earlier question I saw when someone talked about separate pollutants and aren't they regulated separately, not effectively enough that we can say that we can lean on the Federal Clean Air Act to solve these issues. California has the opportunity to be stronger, as we have been in other areas. So we actually see the recent auction failure as an inevitability that was pretty predictable for the system. You know, when the economy crashes, folks just hold on to their credits and don't need to invest, and hope that it will lead to a conversation about whether cap and trade is really the right model for California, if it's really working and serving the purpose and goal and intent of AB 32, and if there are alternatives that we should be considering, including more direct emissions reductions measures to ensure we meet our climate target and also help address inequities.
Fantastic. Here's another question. My understanding is that the focus on carbon in our policies is because there's no existing regulations on carbon emissions. Do we think that, I think these stand for SOXs, sulfur, nitrogen, PM, lead, carbon dioxide regulations, need strengthening more urgently than carbon dioxide? Can we do it all?
I'm going to say I'm hopeful and I think we can, but we all need to work together across industries and with our communities to make sure that voices are heard, because I can tell you, I've been to several city council meetings now via Zoom, but if there's no public talking about these issues and giving light to them, they're not going to be considered. So we need more voices in the room.
Yeah, and there was a complementary strategy passed when cap and trade was renewed in 2017, the Community Air Protection Program, called otherwise referred to as AB 617. And the goal of that program was supposed to be to tackle, okay, let's pick a select number of communities around the state, and Fresno is one of those communities, to figure out what's going on, to try to attack the issue with monitoring and with a specific plan. And the goal was that when we saw progress on those plans, that those would be policies we might be able to pull out and make statewide or region-wide, to try to really tackle the issue at the source. However, we're a few years in, we still haven't really seen any meaningful movement in terms of actual emissions reductions in communities that we can use to document and make the case for stronger policies. So CEJA and a lot of our members and partners across the state are very engaged in that and hoping that we can make some movement. I know that carbon is a really imperfect tool to try to attack co-pollutants. And so we would love to see stronger regulations across the state to protect communities. So ongoing TBD.
Yeah, that's great. What is your strategy to get counties to build in carbon reduction to their climate action plans? Either of you want to jump in? Katie?
I was going to let Destiny go. I know a lot of our members are engaged in that work. It's tough because the climate plans locally aren't binding, and a lot of you on this call know that. Even the general plans aren't binding. We have an environmental justice element requirement in county and city general plans now. And actually legislation we were looking at this year pre-COVID was to try to strengthen enforcement of those standards and regulations, because we weren't seeing a lot of measurable differences. It's one thing to say everybody's going to have access to safe housing and clean air and good transportation options. It's another thing to actually have implementable policies policies and metrics that will hold you accountable for actually making progress towards that goal. And so that has been an ongoing fight at the local jurisdiction level to get them to be more binding in their strategies. And yeah, something we're looking at, we look at it through the general plans more, through the environmental justice elements, but I think similar lessons apply in the climate action plan space.
Destiny, did you want to add anything on that?
Sure. I was going to say Fresno County is also in the same situation of renewing our general plan. And one of the things that we've been doing here locally is working with several community-based organizations and really just trying to make sure that these processes are watchdogged and that public participation is also incorporated into these plans. So we're being very diligent in making sure that, you know, when public participation is open, that these Zoom, and they're probably going to be Zoom meetings, that these Zoom meetings are able to be translated into Spanish as well, because we want to be able to capture all the communities and all the voices again in the room.
That's great. Thank you. I have a question for you that is not on this list here, but I just want to ask you both, what do you think are the opportunities? This is, you both talked about what a challenging time it is in so many ways with COVID and has been for a long time with racial injustice. And are there opportunities in this moment for us to do something even bigger and bolder than we've ever done before? And if so, what do you think they are? And what are the kinds of things that our participants today can do to make a difference? Whoever would like to go first.
I can go first. I think that these types of virtual events are very, very impactful, because if prior to COVID, I doubt we could probably get 200 people in a room to have these conversations, and then people would have to drive. And, you know, with COVID, I have to say that it has made communication much easier and more accessible. Not for everyone though. I do want to mention that there are still communities that have accessibility problems, but I think in this moment, what we are doing with these types of webinars and digital events can reach a greater amount of people than we could if we were not doing virtual events. So again, everybody on here who's listening, again, I encourage you to act, donate, support, attend, and endorse us. They sound like very small asks, but they are definitely going to make a huge impact. If we got 140 plus people on this digital event to donate, endorse, support AB 345, these are the kind of things that make movements happen. So I encourage you, this is your time to act. Thank you, Destiny. Katie?
Yeah, out of great tragedy and human price, you know, there is an opportunity to re-examine these systems and to help people understand the connection and to think about what this looks like to be bold. You know, thinking about our climate investments to date, I saw another question in the chat, so I'll integrate that. I mean, we were relying on continued pollution, like the money was coming from pollution, from people exceeding the pollution target. And then we were trying to reinvest that as if that somehow canceled it out or made it okay or was progress. And it really wasn't. So when we step back and look at what it would really take to get to 2030, as much as I don't agree with the outcome of the 2010 scoping plans and the 2008 scoping plans when we picked cap and trade, you know, you think back to that moment, those were all new policies. Those were all new regulations. Those were all new strategies. We were just starting the renewable portfolio standard. We were just starting all of this really bold work. And now we've learned so much over the last 12 years that what would it look like for us to really step back and put everything on the table and talk about what 2030 looks like? Because it's going to be fundamentally different from how we move goods, from how we employ people to how we work. And maybe now in this moment when we're feeling that and we've shown ourselves that we're capable of great change. You know, a year ago, people said that mass teleworking wasn't possible. Well, look at what we're doing. So like literally now that we've shown that we are reminded ourselves that we're capable of great change, I'm hopeful that the conversations we're engaging in now with our members, with members in other states in Washington and Oregon, we can really start to reimagine what this looks like and be bold again, because we got, I think, a little complacent, a little comfortable in our climate policy and our work, even though so many were still suffering. And hopefully now that everybody's eyes are open and everybody's paying attention, we can revisit.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. And we've gotten some interesting feedback in the last month or so at the Climate Center. People asking, shouldn't we include in Climate Safe California universal access to internet? It's a really interesting concept in the context of climate justice, and it's something that I think our whole movement should be considering, actually.
Here for all.
One more question from here. Given the negative impact of natural gas use in buildings and indoor air quality and the leaks along the entire system, the entire life cycle of natural gas production with methane, what are the most equitable solutions and policies to electrify and decarbonize buildings? Is this a priority for EJ communities?
Absolutely. There's a GridWorks report that CEJA was a party to, talking about like the cost of transitioning off of natural gas. This is a huge priority, not just for power generation, but for in buildings as well. And there are great opportunities there when you think about it. I was talking to a local service provider who works predominantly with Black youth in South Sacramento. He wants to train his kids on how to be HVAC technicians, how to be, how to be the folks who go in and do the weatherization and the retrofitting work in buildings, because he sees it as a growth opportunity and an industry that they could grow into for good jobs. So there's a lot of opportunity to be thoughtful and intentional about how we do that work. It may be more costly, but it will be better in the end if we invest in layer in the workforce programs and the intentional outreach. We have the solar multifamily housing. I mean, there's just so many great examples of how that's been working in California, and so many great examples like you gave for why that transition more urgently is better for a whole range of reasons.
Yeah, it's great. Well, super. Any last comments that either of you would like to make before we wrap up? This was fantastic, and we're so grateful to both of you for all that you're doing for our communities, for our state, and for our future.
I just want to welcome folks. I want to thank you all for participating, because I think learning is such a big part of the moment we're in. We're all learning. It's all changing so quickly. BIPOC wasn't even a term that we were using just a couple months ago. So I just encourage you all to keep your minds open and to continue to center frontline voices and BIPOC communities in your thinking, and we'll get there together.
Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you to everybody who took time out of your Friday to listen to us. And I hope that everybody learned something today. It was informative. And I just want to say again, we must inspire, empower, and repeat. And I hope that today everyone leaves inspired and a little bit more empowered to take some action. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Katie, for what you're doing at the state level, Destiny, for what you're doing in Fresno and the Central Valley. And we just so are grateful for your leadership. Katie, good luck as you become a city councilwoman in Sacramento. We'll look forward to great things from you. Destiny, we love working with you and look forward to seeing what you'll be doing in the future as well. And we look forward to supporting both of you in the efforts that you're leading. Thank you all for joining us today. I do want to let you know we got 15 endorsements for Climate Safe California during our discussion here. Really appreciate everyone who did that, and really urge everyone to support AB 345. Write to your state senator and assembly person to take action on that today. Support CEJA, support the Climate Center, and join us on August 5th at our policy summit. Thank you all again for being here, and special thanks to Katie and Destiny. Have a great weekend. Take good care, everybody. Thank you so much.